Today we'll be covering the climactic Battle of Midway. I'll be providing the maps and visuals as usual, but we've got a special guest who will be narrating the experience. I'll let him take it away.
Hello, I'm Craig Simons. I'm the Ernest J. King Professor of Maritime History at the U.S. Naval War College. The Battle of Midway takes place in early June of 1942, and it's a critical moment because in the first 6 months of that war in the Pacific, the Japanese had been having everything their own way. The Philippines, of course, had fallen. They had conquered the Dutch East Indies. Things looked desperate for the Allied cause. And Midway was critical because it turned that around. It changed the momentum of the war. The Japanese plan from the beginning was to conquer the resource base they needed to get the raw materials that would keep their industrial machinery working in Japan. They were very low on iron and tungsten and oil in particular. So having conquered that area in the South Pacific, they wanted to set up a defensive parameter that would force the United States to fight its way across the Pacific. But to do that, they needed to get rid of the American carriers. And the Japanese plan, Yamamoto's plan in particular, was to create a strategic plan that would draw the American carriers out of Hawaii, where they could be pounced upon and sunk by the Japanese carriers in deep water where they could never be recovered. That would give the Japanese an opportunity to solidify their resource base and defy the Americans to try to fight their way back across the ocean. The Japanese had a very complicated plan for the Battle of Midway. They divided their forces into at least 5 battle groups. One consisted of the submarines that were supposed to ambush the American carriers as they moved their way north. Another consisted of the invasion force that was to land on Midway. Another consisted of the battleships. But the critical aspect of it was the carrier group, the 4 large carriers known as the Kido Butai. That was the key, and Admiral Chester Nimitz knew it. And therefore his goal was to ambush the Japanese carriers, just as it was the Japanese goal to ambush the American carriers. And what made the difference was the contribution of the American code breakers, who were able to tell Nimitz that this was likely to happen at about this time with about this many forces and about where it would happen. The most secret organization in the United States Navy in 1942 was known as Station Hypo. It was a group of rooms in the basement beneath the 11th Naval District Headquarters building on Oahu in Hawaii, and it was run by a lieutenant commander named Joe Rochefort. And their job was to get the raw data that was intercepted from the ether, radio messages from the Japanese, and attempt to winkle some pieces of useful intelligence and information out of those. Now, a lot of people are aware that the Americans had broken the Japanese code by June of 1942. But that's a bit misleading, because what we really were able to do was get just pieces of information, the occasional word, just glimpses of what might happen. And it depended heavily on the analysis by Joe Rochefort and his team as to what that meant. And they were able to tell Chester Nimitz in late May of 1942 that the Japanese seemed to be targeting Midway, that they would be coming with 4, possibly 5 aircraft carriers, that they planned to capture the island and use it as a base, perhaps as a bargaining chip in subsequent negotiations. But because Nimitz knew they were coming, he was able to organize his forces in such a way as to surprise the Japanese instead of the Japanese surprising the Americans. The Americans would surprise the Japanese, and it was the code breaking that did that. Maybe the most famous story about code breaking in the Battle of Midway is that Joe Rochefort was pretty certain that he knew what the target was, that it was the atoll of Midway. And he told Chester Nimitz that, but he got pushback from Washington. The bosses, his intelligence bosses in Washington said, well, how sure are you? It could be elsewhere. It could be Samoa. It could be New Caledonia. It could be the west coast of the United States. And what Rochefort sought to do was prove to them, not to himself, because he was pretty certain, but he had to prove to them that Midway was the target. And so what he did was, by subterranean cable, tell the people at Midway to send a radio signal back to Hawaii saying, our saltwater distillers have broken down, implying that we're running out of fresh water. And then he waited. And sure enough, the Japanese intercepted that message and reported to Tokyo that Midway, AF, the symbol for Midway, was running short of water. Now, Rochefort had his smoking gun to prove that Midway was indeed the target. Knowing that the Japanese coming was critical, but it was not entirely clear what Nimitz should do about that. Remember that the overall strategic plan for World War II was that the Allies would focus on Germany first, in addition to which a lot of the new construction combatant ships would not become available in the Pacific until 1943. So one option for Nimitz was simply to say, well, how important is Midway after all? The carriers are far more important. I don't want to risk my scarce carriers against a superior force. I'm going to let the Japanese have Midway, and then later on, when we're stronger, we can take it back from them. But he decided not to do that. He believed that having the advance information that they were coming and knowing roughly where they would be gave him an opportunity he didn't want to let pass. So he took his 2 available carriers and sent them up to a position, interestingly enough, called Point Luck, to wait for the Japanese arrival, and then his 3rd carrier, the Yorktown, which had come limping back from the Battle of the Coral Sea, trailing a 10-mile oil slick behind it with serious damage from the Battle of the Coral Sea. He would patch that up quickly